You were not meant to be a slave to the grind. You were not meant to trade your life force for money. You can escape gravity. You can unlock your life. You got this. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to Unlock Your Life. I'm your host, Jennings Smith. Guys, I want to tell you a story about a deal that I just put under contract and then terminated, right? This was a 9 cap deal. So if you know real estate, a 9 cap means you take the net operating income and you divide it by 9%, and that's your purchase price, right? So let's do easy math. If you have $100,000 in net operating income or profit, and you divide that by a 10 cap, 10%, it equals $1 million. So if you can buy this property for $1 million, it's going to spit off $100,000 in cash flow every year if you bought it cash. All right. If you have debt, then you got to pay your debt, and then that eats into the cash flow. But that's what a cap is. So this was a 9 cap deal, which in real estate is a pretty good deal. Now, it wasn't a multifamily deal. It was a commercial retail deal. So on the bottom floor, there was 4 shops. There was a restaurant, there was a smoke shop, there was a convenience store, there was a clothing store. And up top, it had a bunch of little tenants. There was, I think, 20 like micro offices, 100 to 200 square feet. These people were paying, $400, $500 a month to rent a little office. And they were full, right? It was 97% occupied. The bottom floor was paying part of the triple net lease expenses. So they were on a triple net lease, meaning they had to pay their rent. And then in addition to that, they have to pay part of the taxes, part of the insurance, part of the maintenance, depending on the percentage of the building that they were renting, right? So if you're familiar with triple net leases and how commercial works, if I place a tenant, like let's say I buy an AutoZone, right? An AutoZone auto parts store for $2 million, right? Well, they have a monthly rent of maybe $10,000 a month. I'm just using round numbers, $10,000 a month. But if it's a triple net lease, they also have to pay the yearly taxes. They also have to pay the insurance bill. They also have to pay the maintenance and repairs. If their toilet breaks, they have to pay to fix it. And so you can take that $10,000 a month, and it's fairly durable income, right? It's like you're not going to have to pay your expenses out of that. You're actually going to be able to keep that. That's until they leave, right? Or they don't renew their lease, and then you go vacant and you have to place a new tenant. So there's risk there. But as far as passing along the expenses to the tenant, it's a pretty cool feature of a triple net lease. So the bottom floor was on triple net leases. The top floor was not. They wanted about $2 million for this deal. And I was thinking, okay, I can go in there and I'm going to leave the bottom floor alone, right? They're already on longer term leases. I can't change the leases if I wanted to. But, when they renew in 3-4 years, maybe I can bump rents a little bit. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But the value play was on the top floor, right? Because there was a little bit of vacancy and nobody was paying their share of the expenses and the rents were very, very low. It wasn't really being managed too well. It was being managed remotely. Nobody was cleaning the place. Nobody was, just checking on the tenants and managing it properly. So there was a value add there. And my thought was, if I can recapture all of the expenses, right? I've got the bottom floor paying some of them, but if I can recapture the expenses from the top floor and maybe bump rents a little bit, then I can make this building be worth $2.7 million. So if I can be all in for, 1.9 to 2 million, and in a couple of years it's worth 2.6, then maybe we get lucky on some of the bigger tenants. When they renew, we can do rent bumps there, or we can place a new tenant at a higher rent. That's going to increase the valuation of the property. And so I was willing to take this gamble because it was a pretty simple operational play to increase the value of the building by, $600,000 or $700,000. So that was my play. So we came to the broker and we put it under contract, and the broker, he told us, hey, this is kind of a little bit of a wonky deal. The financials are a little bit messy. It's mom and pop owned and it's not really managed very well, but it's a good property. It's in a good location and you'll be able to make it more valuable. So we're thinking, Okay, yeah, we can deal with that. We can deal with some missing financials here and there. And we've bought mom and pop deals from apartment owners before. So we get into the due diligence. So the first thing we did was walk the property. We went in, we walked all the offices upstairs, and yeah, you could see, I mean, the bathrooms were kind of dirty, it was cluttered. There was a couple vacant offices, maybe a little bit more than they had said in the beginning, but it was generally okay. The bottom floor was okay. The convenience store was nice. The restaurant was nice. So we're thinking, okay, this deal's got legs, right? Because you want to walk a property. That's one of the first things I do when I put something under contract. And sometimes, if I have a signed letter of intent, which is the first step to go into contract, you send out an offer with basically the top 5 terms. So, like, what's my purchase price? What are my contingencies? What's my inspection period or my due diligence period where I can release the deal? How much of a down payment, earnest money am I putting down? And then how long do I need to close it? Because if you can agree on those, 5 big things, then the rest of it is just minor details. And because purchase and sale agreements are typically very long, drawn out, you involve lawyers and costs. And so you want to kind of hammer out the agreement with an LOI first, a letter of intent first. So once you've got that agreed to, then I'll typically fly out to the property, or if it's local, I'll go there and walk it. We walked it, we went to contract. Okay. So once we go to contract, there's a list. You go into your due diligence period. And typically a due diligence period is anywhere on an apartment deal or a retail commercial deal. It's usually 30 to 45 days, sometimes 60 days. The longer, the better. If you're the buyer, the longer, the worse for the seller, because they want the money to be non-refundable. They want you to be sure you're buying it and you're good to go. So what we negotiated was a 30-day due diligence with a 30-day close. And we had a financing contingency though. So it kind of ran the whole time. The financing contingency was 60 days. So we had opportunity to back out of the deal for any reason or no reason within the first 30 days. After 30 days, we could still back out of the deal if our financing fell through. So we go under contract, and now we have permission basically from the seller to really dig into the financials and the leases. And so they sent that stuff over, and the leases looked okay. It was generally what they said. There was some missing leases or leases that were up for renewal that hadn't been renewed, but I could deal with that. We got into the rent roll, and it was basically purported that the rent roll is about 18 grand, and then they're collecting another 4 or 5,000 a month in expenses from the people that are on the triple net lease. So I was kind of expecting they're collecting maybe 22,000 a month. Maybe there's some delinquency, maybe they're not, maybe they're collecting 20,000, maybe they're collecting 19,000. But it's somewhere near what the rent roll is. So if my rent roll on an apartment building is $100,000 a month, I want my collections to be at least 90%, hopefully 95%. 5% delinquency, it's really hard to get below that because people are people. People pay late and they get behind, and it is what it is. It's just part of the game. You write it into your underwriting. But as we got into this, we found a problem, and I'm going to tell you about that in a second. So this problem increased the risk on the deal. And as we dug in further, we found that, there weren't just a couple vacancies upstairs, there was 4 or 5. And then there was another block tenant that had 4 offices that had moved in and had not paid since they moved in. Been in there for 4 or 5 months and had not paid a rent payment. I think they paid their deposit and that was it. So that was not ideal. Then there was another 4 or 5 tenants that were struggling, months behind. Eventually they'd make it up and then they'd get behind again, but definitely not a high quality tenant that's paying on time. Now, the bottom floor tenants on the triple net leases who were running, I would say, maybe a little bit more professional businesses, they were paying their rent. However, they weren't paying their share of the triple net lease expenses. And this was significant. We're talking $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month of their share of the insurance, their share of the taxes, their share of the maintenance and repairs. And for whatever reason, that wasn't being collected. Maybe it was just because it wasn't being managed well. Maybe the tenants weren't aware that they had to pay those things because it was in their leases, But what's in the leases versus what actually happens can be two different things. And you really got to pay attention to beyond the paper, right? What's the story of the building? What's actually going on in the building? Because when we saw this, the project now shifted, right? It was not a bad project. It's not a bad building. It's a beautiful building and it's in a good location. And it's definitely cost something to build that building. So you got to think about replacement value. Like just because the numbers aren't necessarily adding up doesn't mean you just throw the deal in the garbage. You have to look somewhat at the potential of what the deal could be. But when you start paying for potential and you start eating into the profits you're going to make, right? You're paying for the profits you're going to make in the future, and the seller's getting the benefit of that. You can go too far, right? So, what was changing about this deal was the risk, and what was changing about this deal was the plan. So, if you remember, my initial plan was just roll over the top floor rents with a little bit of a rent increase and get that triple net expense reimbursement going and clean it up, get a management company in there, and that was it, right? It was a pretty simple, easy play that I could stand to make six or $700,000 doing that. Well, now what's my play, right? I've got to reassess. I've got to reassess my risk, and then I've got to reassess my reward. So now I'm looking at, okay, one, I've got at least 30% vacancy upstairs because I've got 4 or 5 vacant units. I've got another 4 to 6 people that are not paying and haven't paid and probably got to go. And that's even worse than a vacancy because you still got to get them out before you can release the place. Then I have another 3 or 4 people that are struggling along. They're not paying on time, and that's going to increase my delinquency. And one of the biggest risk factors of this that increased was the triple net lease expenses on the bottom floor because these people were locked into long-term leases. Those spaces are hard to fill. The upper floor, small spaces, fairly cheap rent, not too bad to fill. But the bottom floor, they're hard to fill. And if I go to this restaurant and I go to this convenience store and I go to this, the other places and say, hey, you haven't been paying your triple net leases, you actually have to pay them, and they can't, or they're not cash flowing enough to do that, or they just say, oh yeah, well, the seller told us that we didn't have to do that. That was just in the lease. If that happens and they either can't pay me or they leave, now I've got a big problem on my hands, right? Because these guys are carrying the majority of the income that's actually coming in. So I'm really increasing my risk there. I'm also increasing my risk on my cash flow. So when you look at a deal, ideally, you can buy it as is and it'll cover your note as is, and you can make it better to churn out some cash flow. Or maybe it's even cash flowing beyond the note day one. That's even better. But in this instance, when you factored in not getting the triple net leases and all of it, they were only collecting $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 a month when we had underwritten that they were collecting 20, right? So now we're not covering our note. We're not even, I don't even know that we'd be covering the expenses of the building at that point. And we're going to be having to fork over $10,000 a month in additional cash just to keep the property afloat. And this is even before the challenges we may have with getting a loan on this property in the current condition. And so my risk on this deal went way up, and my workload on the deal, my plan that I had to now execute, that went way up. That's going to be a lot harder, especially if I have to place new triple net leases, new restaurants, new people that can pay the market rent, plus the cost for the insurance and taxes, the triple net lease stuff. So if I'm looking at this, my risk has gone up, my workload has gone up. It's not a simple operational play. It doesn't cash flow. I've got to bring additional cash above and beyond my down payment and my loan just to get it stabilized. Well, I need to make a whack of money, right? If I'm going to do all that, then I'm going to take that risk, and I need to be rewarded for that. And so we talked as a group, we talked as a partnership. We said, well, what price does this deal still make sense to us with what we know about it? And we kind of came around to the conclusion that 1.5 was the right number. Initially, we were under contract right around 2. Now we need to be 500 grand less so that we can make $1 million, maybe $1.1 million, and maybe more, right? Because we may exceed our pro forma. We may hold it longer than we thought, but we can't pay this price, right? Because this was advertised as a 9 cap. This was advertised with $160,000 of in place NOI, right? It was already cash flowing $160,000 a year. Well, really, they're only collecting $150,000 a year. So it's definitely not cash flowing $160,000 a year. There's no way. And this is where we've got to go back to the broker and say, listen, we knew that the financials were a little messy. We knew that the records were going to be a little iffy. However, we didn't realize that this deal was collecting so little and we need to retrade the price, right? We still like the building. It's not a bad building. It's not a bad location, but we got to be in it at a lower basis. And the broker said no, and that's the power of competition, right? And it's not that I'm smarter than anybody else or I know more or I'm more conservative or less conservative. It's just everybody has their own different plan of what they're going to do with the building. Everybody has their own different risk-o-meter of what's the reward that's worth it to take on that risk. And so he said, hey, we got other cash offers and we've got people that are going to close it as is. And so we're not going to accept your retrade price and we're going to terminate. Because if you try to retrade, you're basically breaking the terms of the agreement. And so the seller can refuse and then boom, the contract is terminated. So we did end up terminating the contract, or they did because they wouldn't accept our price, it was a mutual termination, but we terminated the thing. But the next guy, if he does buy it at that, then he may do the same plan as I'm doing. He may not. I mean, he may blow out all those walls upstairs. He may get long-term triple net leases. He may get a higher quality tenant. Maybe he's going to rent it out like a WeWork space. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what he does and what price makes sense for him to do it. And that's the beauty of competition, right? One man's trash is another man's treasure. And somebody could look at this deal, pick it up and say, hey, I love it. And I love it at that price and I'll close it. I'm also following up with the broker to say, hey, if those cash buyers fall through, they dig into it and they don't really like what they see, I'm still open to it. I'm still open at $1.5 million. Let's chat, let's talk. But I hope they sell it, right? I hope they get the price that they want for it. I mean, if they can find the right buyer that'll pay that price, that's fine. But the point of the story is things are not always as they seem, right? Things are not always as they seem on paper. And if we had gone off of just the rent roll and the pro forma and the triple net leases and saying, oh, well, they're by contract having to pay, so they must be paying. If we went by all that, we could have walked into something that maybe we weren't prepared for, right? Not that the problem couldn't have been solved, but it was something that we weren't prepared for that game plan. We weren't prepared to take on that much risk, and we weren't prepared to do that for that little amount of profit. So we rewound, and what I'm trying to tell you is the due diligence period is extremely important, right? You need to have a plan. What am I going to do in week 1? What am I going to do in week 2, week 3, week 4? Typically, you got 30 days so that you can spend the least amount of money, get the most amount of data so that you can make the best decision. Because there's a lot of moving parts and pieces in that first 4 weeks. Walking the property, interviewing the property manager, interviewing the tenants, checking the rent rolls, checking the expenses, verifying what my taxes are going to be, what my insurance is going to be, looking at their bank statements. How much are they actually collecting versus what they say they're collecting? You need to know all that stuff so that you can make the decision. You got to get your lender on board, right? You're not going to get maybe a final commitment, but you can talk to a lender or two and they can give you feedback. Hey, we like the deal, or we don't like the deal, or we would do this deal, we would loan you 70%, or we'd loan you 60%, or we'd probably be at 7% interest, or we'd be at 6.5%, or we'd be at 8% interest. We could give you a year of interest only, or we're going to amortize it right out of the gate. All those things so that you can cement in your assumptions. You're making all these assumptions up front to put the deal under contract. And then your due diligence period is where you're making sure that all those assumptions that you made are correct. And some of those assumptions are ones that you made on your own. Some of those are from information that you got from the seller. And that information may not be true, right? A lot of times it is inflated. A lot of times it is made to look a little bit better than it truly is because your interests are not aligned, right? Your interests with the seller are not aligned, other than you both want to transact, but he wants to transact at the highest price. You want to transact at the lowest price. And so he's going to try and make the deal look as good as he can. You're on the flip side trying to make the deal look as bad as you can to get the best price. And so there's a meet in the middle there. And speaking of retrading, it's kind of a frowned upon tactic in this world, right? Where you go through all these negotiations, you agree upon a price, and you put it under contract, and then later, maybe 30 days later, 45 days later, whatever, you try to retrade the price. And it's not a great look. It can give you a bad reputation, but when it's justified, when it's warranted, you need to do it. You need to not be afraid to do it. When the seller has not disclosed something material, something that's drastically affecting your underwriting, it's better to be a little embarrassed, be a little uncomfortable, ask for the retrade, or even terminate if it's bad enough and walk away, because it's not worth it to rope yourself into something that's going to be a problem for you later on. All right, guys, I hope this story was useful. I hope it was helpful for you. If you want to grab my underwriting sheet of how I analyze these deals with instructional videos on how to use it, shoot me a DM. I'll send you it. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. I want you to learn. I want you to start taking steps towards buying apartment complexes, mobile home parks, self-storage, commercial real estate, whatever you're into, and unlocking your life. All right, guys, have a great week. Peace.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.